we get to the story of what happened next. Okay, so the plane takes off, and it arrives at Andrews Air Force Base. I usually say 6 o'clock, but actually the time when it actually stops, it's 6:04. And the question then became, well, how did they get the body out of the plane? And that's a whole other story. And I believe, based on the evidence, that the lights went out at Andrews Air Force Base, and the plane came in for a landing, and it turned onto a runway, well, it was taxiways.
Okay.
And that's when they got the body off the plane at the taxiway.
Okay.
But I don't want to dwell on that right now, except that they did not do it in front of the world's press.
Okay.
And up the runway at that taxiway, as far as I can see, was Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and Robert Kennedy. And why do I say that? Because first of all, I have all kinds of pictures of Andrews that are now available, and film footage, and I've analyzed them. And it's clear that Robert McNamara is in charge of this whole thing. He's strutting around, and you can't get Air Force One to make a stop at an unannounced location. You can't just say, like hailing a cab on 3rd Avenue in New York. Somebody has to instruct the pilot. That order has to come over the radio. That when you get to Andrews, or the pilot or the control tower has to tell them you're going to go down this so many 100 feet, go on to taxiway such and such, and stop. Now, according to the Manchester book, and he conducted interviews with the pilot, he sees Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, and I think he said Robert Kennedy standing right there. Well, that doesn't describe the stop that the public saw on TV. They're not there at that point.
So you think there was an up the runway stop, unbeknownst to the public?
There was a down. It's called actually the end of the runway stop.
Okay, end of the runway stop.
It comes in for landing, turns onto a taxiway, and stops there. And in the notes of the Secret Service, the actual landing time is 5:58, but it pulls into public view at 6:04. And the lights go out at Andrews, like you can hear Nancy Dickerson. I have these tapes. The lights have gone out at Andrews Air Force Base here. And then there's this puzzlement as to why the lights have gone out. And then suddenly, oh, and here's Air Force One. It's now arrived. Well, that's what happened. It was down the runway, and then there was a stop. And I would also argue, further evidence of that is not only in the Manchester book, but that how did Robert Kennedy get on the plane? Because when the plane comes to a stop, there's no evidence. I don't see any evidence that Robert Kennedy ran up any ramp. It seems to me that if Robert Kennedy was at the public stop, all the reporters would have seen him. They would say, oh, there goes the Attorney General. He's running up the front steps to get on Air Force One. There's no such report. But when the rear door opens, there's Robert Kennedy holding Jackie's hands. How did he get on the plane? In fact, some of the people who knew Robbie Kennedy said, well, was he in Dallas or something? What's he doing on Air Force One? They didn't get it. But I think that's further evidence of the stop. But the best evidence of the stop is that the times. 5:58 is when the plane lands. 6:04 is when it's at the public stop. The lights went out. And I mean, a grade school person looking at the situation would say something happened. And then you go to the Manchester book, and he conducted these great interviews, which are all under seal. But he describes it in his book, that there's Bobby Kennedy, and I think he says McNamara, I'm not sure. But the bottom line is there's Bobby Kennedy and the Secretary of Defense or whatever. Well, there's no such event at the public stop. So, now, when the plane comes down the runway and it comes to the actual public stop, and I've looked at these frames, there's Robert McNamara, and next to him is an aide with a big, huge gym bag, the kind like I used to play squash, you have your squash rackets in. And I've concluded, and this is my own inference, that he had coveralls or something. And he had an aide-de-camp, who was with him, who carried this bag that had his coveralls. And I assume that at the stop, he personally supervised the removal of Kennedy's corpse.
Robert McNamara?
I think Robert McNamara must have done that, yes. Because how else did they get the body off the plane without anybody at Andrews seeing it? It had to be at that I keep calling it an up the runway stop, the end of runway drop-off.
Okay.
We've given it a name, Sean does call it ERDO, E-R-D-O, end of runway drop-off.
Okay.
And then we can get into the whole logic, the chronology of what happened next, because at the public stop, and as we'll see in the video, the announcers are saying, and there's a Navy ambulance that's pulled up to the side of the plane. Well, there's a whole other story going on, which we can get to in a minute. I want to get to the raised arm. But the other story is, how did they plan to get the body back into the coffin? What they plan to do is get that body get the coffin into a helicopter, one of those twin rotors, bring it to Walter Reed Army Medical Center, bring the body there, put the body back in the coffin, and then say, oops, wrong hospital, Mrs. Kennedy prefers Bethesda for the autopsy, and then fly over to Bethesda. This is all in the radio transmissions, and we can discuss that later. It's really important, but it's not the most important thing. The most important thing, and this plan got, let me pause here. This plan got delayed, this plan got interrupted because a young Kennedy naval officer saw the Navy ambulance, and he said, why don't you pull over to the side of Air Force One? You see, the Navy ambulance was not there for transportation of the coffin. It was there because it had a cardiologist in case Lyndon had a heart attack. And inside the ambulance was a guy named Dr. Welch. Well, his group was told, well, pull the Navy ambulance over there. Well, they screwed up the plans that were on the radio, which was to get that coffin into a helicopter and go over to Walter Reed. That's all in the radio transmissions, and we can talk about that. It's very dramatic stuff.
Let me just interrupt so we get clear about the purpose of this runway stop that occurred before the plane stopped in front of the cameras and the public.
It was to get the body off the plane.
Okay.
Get the body off that plane so they could then bring it somewhere. They had to get it into a body bag, and they had to get it, as a matter of fact, they ended up getting it over to Bethesda Naval Hospital, not Walter Reed. But this is important. In Marie Famer's notes, and she's the secretary to Lyndon Johnson, and she's making the notes on the plane, she says, 5:58 for the plane stop, body to Walter Reed. That was the plan.
That was the plan.
To train the body to Walter Reed, and the radio transmissions are filled with Colonel Chester Clifton saying, now here we want these 4 ramps. On the starboard side we want a ramp for the First Lady. We're bringing her off on the starboard side. And we want a ramp on the port side. We want a lift on the port side for that heavy coffin. And we want a lift on the staircase on the port side so Lyndon can come down. All of the stuff is spelled out in the radio transmissions, which I published in Chapter 31 of Best Evidence. What I didn't have is what was all this about. And then I met with Chester Clifton that summer. The book was published, before it was published, and he granted me this interview in his office in Washington. We went over the transmissions, and it's a very dramatic interview. I have a tape of it. But the point is, he all pretty much admitted that they could have done anything they wanted at the back of the plane because they could have had the body out of the coffin. We talked about this. But anyway, he understood that there might be a body coffin problem here. The body was not in the coffin, and this was about to be published in my book. So he was reasonably forthcoming with me, but he didn't give away the store.
Before we continue with that part of the conversation, let us go back to
Sorry, I'm gonna get my glass. Go on.
let's go back to the body and luggage.
Yeah.
And they put JFK's body on a ledge.
I believe so, and I'll tell you why. Yes.
Yeah, I want to know what the evidence is that that's what happened.
Okay, so we're going to have to skip some of these logistics of the transportation of the body coffin reuniting, which didn't take place as planned. So now what end up happening at Bethesda Naval Hospital is the ambulance arrives at the front of the hospital, and it arrives at 6:55 carrying the coffin, Bobby Kennedy, and Jacqueline. And one of my rather big breakthroughs was the realization, and it was just one of these aha moments, that Bobby knows the coffin is empty. I mean, he's not being deceived. In the beginning, I thought he was deceived. He wasn't. He's with McNamara. They told him, listen, the body's your brother is in luggage.
So that casket that arrived with Robert Kennedy and Jackie Kennedy, that casket is empty.
Is empty because the body had been taken out of the casket in Dallas, and it was somewhere else, and I now know, I'm pretty sure it's the forward luggage compartment.
Okay.
And the body arrives 20 minutes before the casket. And that's what Best Evidence has, all those chapters about the witnesses who know about that.
So they offload the body at this runway stop.
Yeah.
And it takes off to Bethesda in a helicopter.
Well, I think they used a chopper.
Okay. So we think with a helicopter.
Yeah, I think so. And then from the helicopter it was transferred to a black hearse. And the black hearse arrived at the back of Bethesda Naval Hospital, as described by Dennis David, who was there when the was there when the black hearse arrived with federal agents, and the body was in a shipping casket, and Paul O'Connor opened the shipping casket, and inside was a body bag. So all of that is documented previously in Best Evidence. That part I know cold. Okay. So what's new? Well, what's new is that the person in charge of the military honor guard is named Philip Wheel, commander-in-chief of the military district of Washington. The Army divides the country into districts, and MDW is the acronym for the military district of Washington, which is the Washington, D.C. capital area. They handle security in the Capitol, including all state funerals.
Okay.
So they have an honor guard that met the plane. They don't know they're meeting an empty casket. Well, Wheel apparently found out that there's multiple caskets and there's some charade going on. And maybe he was briefed up to a point, but anyway, here's what happened over at Bethesda. He had an executive assistant named Richard Lipsey, young guy in his 20s. Lipsey arrives by helicopter at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and apparently Wheel is there, and Wheel goes over to Lipsey, takes his gun off, and straps his gun on Lipsey's waist, and he says, "You guard the body and don't you leave it." Now, Lipsey then goes to the back of the hospital where the body has arrived in this black hearse, and there's all kinds of security at the autopsy room, and they're not going to let anybody in there. But Lipsey has been told by General Wheel that he's going in that room
to guard that body.
Yeah, to guard it. There was no question about it. He was not fooling around. Lipsey didn't understand the seriousness of it. Get this, he had never been in combat. He had never seen a dead body before, like not even his grandmother at a funeral or something. That's the impression I get.
Okay.
And what happened is Lipsey goes in, and I learned all this stuff personally from Richard Lipsey in 1998. I had interviewed him on the phone in 1979. There's a document from the House Select Committee that didn't become available of their interview with Lipsey until about 1995. So I'm putting together all this stuff after the fact. But in 1998, I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where Richard Lipsey lives.
Okay.
And let me tell you, Richard Lipsey is not your ordinary guy. He's not worth $100,000 or $500,000. He's worth tens of millions of dollars because of some sporting goods store that his parents owned. And he married a woman who was the heir to one of the major clothing fortunes. And they live on this estate in this palatial residence with huge ponds and swans floating around in these ponds, and the interior of the house looks like the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I mean, it's really amazing. Okay. But here's this tall guy who doesn't want to get involved, wouldn't let me use a tape recorder, wouldn't let me record anything. And I'm with a woman, a friend of mine named Marta Richards from Princeton, and that's why I went to Baton Rouge to see Marta. I wasn't going there to see Richard Lipsey. Okay. But this turned out to be very important. Okay. Marta, it turned out, knew Richard Lipsey's wife or a relative or something, and she said, why don't you try to see Lipsey while you're here? Well, I had a great idea. So
you called him.
So she set this up.
Okay.
And I entered the house, the palatial residence of Richard.
So he did welcome you to the home?
Yes, he welcomes me.
And he knew who you... No, he didn't know who you were by the way.
Oh, yes. No, he knew I wrote Best Evidence, but
okay.
he made clear that he wasn't going to agree with any of my book. He makes this big thing of taking out Gerald Posner's book. Okay. So, this book was very good, case closed. Okay. Now, what am I going to do about this,
But yet he was willing to see you. But
yes, he was, with his wife, Susan Lipsey.
Okay.
So we're sitting in this thing that looks like this room that looks like the Metropolitan Museum, and everything's marble and beautiful and crystal. Okay. And we're sitting there, and this meeting goes on for about an hour or two. And Richard Lipsey still, in 1998, does not understand the subterfuge that took place in 1963.
All those years later.
That's right. He didn't understand it. And I had to explain to him, well, the ambulance that came in at the front had an empty casket. And we went through this whole thing, and then he had these aha moments while he was speaking to me. And he made clear that, the body came in the rear, and the ambulance in the front just an ambulance. And I said, no, there was a casket in there. And that's when he realized that there was a decoy and all this other stuff, which he knew about, but he didn't have a complete understanding. But now we get to what he witnessed. Okay. So he tells me what the body looks like when he walked into the room. Now, the FBI had not yet arrived, and the body was a bloody mess. There was blood all over the body, blood and gook and gore, and one arm was raised, like a Heil Hitler salute, he tells me.
Really?
So, yes, really. And, I mean, he used the word Heil Hitler. It was Kennedy saluting from the grave. He never forgot it. And what was irritating about his whole thing is that on the one hand, he's relating to me this critically important information, which he did not understand. And by the way, I didn't understand why one arm would be raised either. So he didn't understand it, and I didn't understand it. But he was relating all this to me. And it was irritating because he wouldn't come to terms with that anything was wrong. So we were getting on with the interview, and he's telling me what happened next. That the autopsy doctor, Commander Humes, ordered the Navy to bring in a pail of water and Tide and a scrub brush. And so they're brushing down the body, they scrub all the blood off the body so they can do an autopsy.
Really?
Yeah. Now, what's wrong with this is, first of all, it's pretty gory. But second of all, what's wrong with this is it's not in the autopsy report. You know, nobody says in the autopsy report, the body arrived in this terrible condition, and I had to issue an order for a pail of water and a scrub brush and have 2 Navy guys scrub down the body. What the autopsy report starts is that the president was riding in a car in Dallas and there were 3 shots fired from this building or something like that. In other words, the autopsy report is all anti-Lee Harvey Oswald, all the official version, nothing about this stuff on the body, which is critically important because it makes the autopsy into a fraud. And then the commanding officer, I know from documents, told Commander Humes, the autopsy doctor, that your job here is to determine the cause of death. Now that's a strange statement to make. Look, here's the way life and death works when you draw a timeline. You go this way, and at this point you die. Up here is called antemortem, that's when you're alive, and over here is called postmortem. Now, when something like this happens, the autopsy doctor is not just to say, well, here's what happened at the dividing line. If something happened to the body after death, you better well believe that it's his job to report that too. But he's told by Commander Kenny, the Surgeon General of the Navy, also known as the Chief of the Bureau of Military Medicine, or Bureau of Navy Surgery, or whatever, that Bureau of Medicine and Surgery, BUMED, B-U-M-E-D is the Navy acronym, that he's just to determine the cause of death. It's to stop. On that timeline, he stops at the cause of death. Well, that's ridiculous in this case because the whole case turns on body alteration.
After death.
After death, right? All the events after death are critical in this case. If this was Law and Order or CSI, that's a ridiculous order. But anyway, so this guy, at least one person, is cleaning up the body and washing it down with Tide and a scrub brush. Can you imagine if the Warren Commission report's autopsy started with that paragraph? Now, what about the arm? Commander Humes has to get up on the table, he tells me, and he sticks his knee in the armpit and forces down the arm. Now the question, I mean, to break what they called rigor mortis, because the arm was raised in rigor mortis at 20 to 25 degrees.
How in the world did that occur?
Right. How in the world did that occur? Now, a lot of times I'm pretty good at coming up with good hypotheses, but I didn't have any answer to that. And I felt a little bit weird about it because I studied math and physics, but I was weak on biology. I didn't study much. And I was wondering all I could focus on was the asymmetry of the situation. One arm goes up, and why not the other arm going? I mean, what's going on here? So now we got to go from July 98 when I had this interview to April 99. And I'd already gotten the drawings from Boeing. I had beautiful colored drawings of the luggage area and the Air Force jet and everything. And now enter Gina Peterman. Gina Peterman is this brilliant friend of mine. She was a former girlfriend from the 1990 period, and she's a Marxist, I think. You know, real left-wing. Her father was a famous Marxist and with what they call the baby brigader. He was connected with the people that went over to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War. Okay, well, anyway, I hadn't seen Gina in a while. We want to have breakfast on a Sunday morning, and I said, Gina, I want to show you these stuff. I want to question you. I want to pick your brain about what's going on here. She's brilliant, and she's a school teacher. People never forget Gina when they have a class with her. She knows math, she knows astronomy, she knows anthropology, she knows everything. She's just a storehouse of information, and she's a wonderful teacher. So we go to Dupar's restaurant in Los Angeles, and she's sitting to the right of me, and I'm over here, and she finds somebody else to talk to, you know, some other school teacher. And I said, look, I'm buying you pancakes. Will you give me some attention, please? I want to tell you this problem. So I show her the thing. Why is one arm raised, you know? And the guy's coming with the pancakes. And I mean, between the time I asked the question and the time Gina had the answer, it was like 30 seconds. She's really smart. She says, oh, silly goose, the arm didn't go up. He was lying on his belly and one arm flopped in the airplane when he was in flight. And I mean, I couldn't believe it. I said, how can I have been so stupid not to see this before? That he was on that ledge, which are clearly shown.
And his arm dropped.
And the question was, and the arm would drop
off the ledge.
Off the ledge if the plane banked or there was vibration. So then we get into this question of, well, where is the ledge and which way did the plane bank? Well, enter Sean Fetter. Sean interviewed Colonel Swindle, the pilot. He had interviewed him in 1993, I believe is the date. My files will have the correct date. And Swindle talked about when he took off from Dallas, you know, he banked sharply to the right because of security and everything, and they're worried about a communist plot or whatever. So he banks sharply to the right. Well, when you do the geometry, that would mean that Kennedy is facing, his head is to the rear, and he's on the ledge on the port side of the plane. And you can actually draw a diagram and show. So when the plane banked to the right, Kennedy's left arm fell off the ledge. No one's in there, and it freezes in rigor mortis all the way to Washington, D.C. for 2.25 hours. So what you have there is the evidence of where Kennedy was on the airplane. And that was really blew my mind, because I think that's when I really knew I was able to connect the raised arm with John Wetherell's information about the plane cleaving. And I said, there's no question he was in the forward luggage area on the such and such shelf at the rear of the plane on the port side. And it was just such a great feeling to know that we knew that much about this.
That's stunning.
Yeah, isn't it? And a friend of mine, Kathy Gorey, who's another one of these brilliant women, and Kathy and Alan, a screenwriter, friends of mine, and she said, you know, they should go get luminol and do a luminol examination of that plane at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, because no matter how well they cleaned it, maybe there's some traces back there. But anyway, all these years have gone by, and I know it's because of the sequester, they no longer let people go on the plane right now, but we're in a period of a tight budget. But maybe someday they'll do luminol.
That's stunning evidence.
Yeah, it really was to me. I said, Kennedy was back there. Oh, and then I hired an artist, and we'll show this artist drawing. I said, I want a cutaway view. And he drew this great picture with the cutaway view showing Kennedy on this and below, and Johnson raising his hand with his hand on the Bible, taking the oath as President of the United States. I mean, this thing is right out of Shakespeare. It has very little to do with the Warren Report.